Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 4 of the 2024 World Championships quarterfinals. It's the final quarterfinal matchup. That felt very difficult to say, and we're gonna know everything by the end of today. We're gonna know our 4 teams that end up making top 4, the semifinals. We're gonna know who is playing who going into next weekend, and of course, obviously, who is going to be considered favorites considering how the series ends up going. This was definitely one of the ones that I think people saw as the most predictable. It certainly is the most quote-unquote predictable of these quarterfinals, but you never really know here at Worlds. Anything can happen at any time. I don't know what's going to happen. I obviously record these before the games end up happening. I record these live, and so I'm excited to see what ends up happening. It's the only Western team performing in the quarterfinals, and I just hope we get a good series. If you want to know my thoughts on the 3 other quarterfinals matchups, go ahead and check out the videos up in the iCard, the playlist up in the iCard. We've, of course, covered every single team and every single game at Worlds so far, the quarterfinals, the Swiss stage, the play-in stage, all of that stuff we've covered in the playlist, and of course, we've also covered every single game that both of these teams have played all year long, every single stage game that both of them have played, because we've covered both regions the entire year. So, very excited to see it culminate. One team will, of course, be eliminated, but one team will be moving on to the semifinals. Let me know what you thought the series was going to be down in the comment section below, and whether or not it lived up to those expectations for you. But without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in each of the games in the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and of course, I will be giving a player of the series at the end to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. It's certainly going to be, a fun one, hopefully we get some good games here, but this is definitely the one matchup that I think was the most predictable coming out of the first round, the quarterfinals here, and that's definitely necessary considering just how surprising I think some of the results of the quarterfinals have been so far. It's, of course, a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 1 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest. This is obviously a very easy matchup to predict in terms of just overall expectations, because Fly is not really even supposed to be here. They are the monkey team that ended up getting out of the Swiss stage. They had a pretty easy schedule. NA, in general, had a pretty easy schedule, and they're able to make their way out by having a civil war. One of the NA teams was guaranteed to get out on that final day by playing each other, and FlyQuest ended up being the representative. They are, of course, the only Western team to get out of the Swiss stage, and they're going to be the only one with any sort of chance to be able to make it through. The problem is they drew what a lot of people would consider to be the best team in the world at the current moment in Gen.G. They just have been so consistent over the course of this year. The only time that this team has faltered at all has been in the finals of the LCK Summer Split. Outside of that, they've been unbeatable. They've dominated domestic play. They've only lost 2 best of 3s in the regular season, and that was the only best of 5 that they lost, at least domestically, all year long. And then the only other best of 3 that they lost at any point this year was at the Esports World Cup, and honestly, that probably helped them overall because it got them home faster. So Gen.G is definitely going into this tournament as a heavy favorite for most people, and they've lived up to it so far. They've been the best team at this tournament in terms of output. They went up against Hanwha Life in that 2-0 matchup in the Swiss stage, and they were able to pull out the win. They didn't lose a single series in the Swiss stage, and now they're coming in, and while it has been quite a while, and as we talked about with LNG in the first quarterfinals matchup, it actually is a pretty big disadvantage to end up going 3-0 because you don't get to play League for like a full 2 weeks. I mean, for Gen.G, it's been like 15, 16 days since they've played a stage game, and so that definitely is a bit of a disadvantage, but even still, when you look at this lineup, when you look at this roster, you have to imagine that things are going to be just fine for them. I think you could make a solid argument that they have the best player in the world at almost every single position. Chovy, to me, right now, is the single best player in the world. He came in at number 1 on my top 20 players at Worlds list. I don't even think it's really all that debatable, at least in terms of the output that we've seen so far. In 2024, there's been nobody that's even been remotely close to his level at the consistency that he has been at. I'm a big fan of what Canyon has been for this team. I think he's been somehow underrated. People talk about how he's only good on carries. I think he's been fine on facilitators. He's just not, like, ideal on facilitators, but when you put him on a carry, when you give him something that can be a primary resource getter for Gen.G, he's the best jungler in the world, and it's not even close. Like, he is so much better than everybody else when he gets to play that role. Keen has been one of the best top laners in the world. I have him at number 2, only behind Bin, who we've already seen do really well, and obviously, you're not looking at that as a negative, and Paze and Lehens, I've been singing their praises all year long. Paze is an absolute monster. I continue to think that he is also underrated. He was my LCK MVP over the course of the Summer Split. I thought he was the most valuable player in terms of where Gen.G was actually putting their resources. And so you don't really have a weak link on the Gen.G roster. You don't even really have anybody that's just really good. Everybody here is elite. It's 5 of the best players in the world, 5 of the top 10 players in the world, in my opinion. And that's a really difficult thing to end up going into. And that's why FlyQuest really has their work cut out for them in this one. They're obviously major underdogs. And I think if they even take a game in this series, they're probably going to feel pretty happy about that. But there are some things to look at that have actually gotten them quite a bit of success over the course of this tournament. They were able to take a game off of Hanwha Life, the team that did beat Gen.G in the summer finals. And a lot of that was because they were just willing to innovate in terms of their drafts. They are very, very interested in trying to get an advantage in that stage of the game. And I think especially with Gen.G having a ton of time off, having 15 days between their last game and this one, draft could actually be a part of the series that could go in favor of FlyQuest. And that's going to be kind of necessary for them to win any games. I think any sort of normal straight up games are just going to go in favor of Gen.G. And so if Fly wants to win, in my opinion, you're going to need to innovate somewhere. We've seen them pull out a lot of crazy things. Obviously, the Amumu's kind of become a regular pick, and whatever Bwipo wants to play has kind of become a regular thing. You're not really, expecting those two to be tied down, but even things like the Nunu have come out, obviously, over the course of this tournament. They've been willing to try to pick things that other teams are just not quite as comfortable playing. The Cassiopeia in the mid lane for quad. There's just a lot of things that I think this team is going to be willing to try and pull out, and I'm sure they've been labbing something. I mean, Bwipo and Inspired they cook in the kitchen for sure, and so, we'll see if they're able to pull out anything interesting, but I think in a straight, like 5v5 in terms of skill, it's going to be very difficult to make an argument for FlyQuest. I think the big, watching point and the matchup of the series, in my opinion, is Canyon versus Inspired. I think if Inspired is able to keep up with Canyon in any sort of way, if Canyon's somehow forced on Maokai duty every game, like he has been for parts of this year, then I think Inspired has a chance to be able to generate some early pressure, and that could make games a little bit closer. But if Canyon is able to win early, I don't think there's any way FlyQuest could actually win a game. Like, that's really the difference maker. Inspired has to be about as good as Canyon is on the other side, which is a gigantic bar, but one that he is going to have to cross. So we'll see if there's a single game in this series that they're going to be able to compete in, or if Gen.G is just going to wipe them aside, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe FlyQuest is actually going to be able to compete. The only way to know is to go game by game, and of course that starts with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 1. They are gonna go up 1-0 in this series. What the hell just happened? What are we doing? This wasn't just a 1-0 win. They dominated this game. Like, they were the better team by a considerable margin. They had a much better draft, something we identified in the preview, that if they were going to win these games, they probably just had to outdraft Gen.G. That's exactly what happened here in game number 1. Great use of flex picks, great understanding of things that might not necessarily be as common in the meta, but certainly fill a very specific niche. And then the execution on this game was incredible. This was a super clean game from Fly. This wasn't just, draft diff and Gen.G couldn't actually fight it out. Like, Gen.G scales pretty infinitely here with the Jinx. I think if you end up getting to these 35, 40-minute fights and everybody's fighting from like 3 or 4 items, I think Gen.G genuinely wins those at that point. And so Fly actually had to be proactive. They had to keep their foot on the gas, and, they won every single fight in this game. There was not a single 5v5 or skirmish anywhere on the map that they ended up losing out in. They were just better across the board. They were better in every aspect, and that is the most shocking part of this entire outcome in this entire game number 1, is just how good FlyQuest ended up being. And for Gen.G, I'm not going to be concerned too much, but really, at some point, I think the concern has to be like, how big of a disadvantage is 3-0 at the end of the day? I mean, this is insane. This team looked completely lost, and it didn't feel like they felt comfortable with the draft that they ended up, playing. We'll see if that ends up getting better over the course of the series. I imagine that it will, even if it is a lot more competitive than we were anticipating. But game number 1 should be all about praising FlyQuest, because this was phenomenal from them. Player of the game, really up to you. I think there are so many good options in terms of the players that were super effective in this one. I think, to me, it comes down to 2 players. It comes down to Bwipo, and it comes down to Inspired, and I think it's really up to you who you want to give it to. I'm going to give it to Bwipo on the Galio. Galio continues to look like a really good answer to these heavy AP comps, and obviously that makes sense. That's kind of what the champion is designed to do, but, we've seen it be really good into Sylas, and obviously now it's kind of transitioned into being the standard Rumble counter in the top lane. Whatever ends up working, like, as long as you're able to get Galio into these fights, he causes so much havoc, so much panic. It is so difficult to end up breaking through him in the late game, and generally, like, this R3 Galio made it impossible for Gen Gen.G to play. This is a drafting masterclass. You end up flexing the R2 Seraphine into the mid lane by drafting the R5 Alistair, and now all of a sudden, you've got this comp where Inspired, who is going to dive in every single fight, he's never going to be able to die, and we kind of saw that. Inspired could play so aggro and so aggressive in a lot of these exchanges, and Bwipo could play even more aggressive in terms of where he was in a lot of these exchanges, looking for flank angles and just trying to disrupt Chovy and Pays and make their lives a lot harder on the backline. And then, Seraphine and, even Ashe can really make it a lot easier for them to not suffer any sort of consequences in that regard. So really well played by the top side of FlyQuest, the two players that have kind of stolen a lot of the spotlight, I would say, for Fly over the course of this year. Rightfully so. They've been, probably the most noticeable players on Fly. They definitely stepped up here in game one, but I don't want to take anything away from the rest of this team either. I mean, Quad made this game so much easier on the Seraphine, like I just talked about. Masu's positioning was excellent. He's so good at Ashe. He's been really good at this champion all year long. Busio had some phenomenal engages, and some people are going to laugh at when he sacrificed himself around the Baron, but that's kind of the support's job in the current meta, is just to get everybody else out. You don't need Baron buff on Alistair. Like, you're not going to be putting him alone in a side wave. So overall, like, Fly did basically everything that they were supposed to do. Maybe you could have asked them to go for Mountain Soul instead of going for Baron after that pick in the middle of the game, but like, that is such a minor like critique in my opinion. It really was not a game losing decision from them in any way, shape, or form. They would have had to do a ton more to lose that game than that, and they didn't really make any other mistakes throughout the entire game. So for Fly, you're just so excited and so happy to see that this team is not only going to, be able to compete with Gen.G, but on, the best day with the right draft and in the right moment, they can actually just like beat Gen.G very convincingly in a game that wasn't even particularly close. And then for Gen.G, this is concerning, and I'm not going to bring up whatever voodoo magic, because I don't believe in, like, voodoo magic, choky, whatever, right? Like, I don't believe that there's some mystical curse on him that he can't win these series. I just think that, obviously, this team hasn't played a stage game in 15 days, and FlyQuest was very prepared and just completely outdrafted them. If that happens again, I'm going to start getting concerned for Gen.G, but at least for now, it's just game number one, and you have time to adapt. I think staying on blue side is still going to be a good thing for them, all things considered, even if that didn't help Top Esports much yesterday, but there are some things that they absolutely need to fix. Lehens is a very easy choice for dead of the game. This was a bad game from Lehens, constantly out of position, constantly going in without the rest of his team. I don't really know what was going on. He is a player that actually is stepping, like, he does step up in big moments, and so you're not really expecting him to continue to be as bad as he was. In game number one, he was MSI Finals MVP for a reason. This is somebody that we know can perform in the clutch, and just, he didn't have it this game. The Leona was entirely useless, and quite frankly was more of a detriment to Gen.G than he was a positive. I think I'm also looking at Canyon, who quite frankly was completely out-jungled by Inspired in this game. I understand Skarner's not going to have nearly as much early pressure as the Xin Zhao, and generally, when you look at these two comps, Gen.G doesn't have, like, early pressure in the same way that FlyQuest has early pressure. They should be able to dictate a lot of the tempo of the early game here, but Inspired did so much of a better job of taking that pressure and tempo and moving it into the mid-game than Canyon did, who just didn't really have a good game on the Skarner. I get that a lot of teams are prioritizing this champion. It doesn't feel like a particularly Gen.G type of champion. You want to get him on something that can be more aggressive, and I know that this team loves to put Canyon on facilitators, but I just don't think that's what they need right now. Keen was not particularly useful on this Rumble. Chovy was still up in gold on Quad, even though Quad was mega fed, and that's just what Chovy is. He's constantly collecting gold inside lanes, and he was doing damage in fights. It just didn't really matter. And Pays, the scary part was that if Pays got a triple kill at any point in this game, like, Gen.G probably wins it. Like, that's when it starts to become scary, but the moment that FlyQuest is able to land that Mountain Soul, all of a sudden, you close it out. You're able to win the fight and end the game. It is really, really impressive stuff from Fly, and if they're able to carry any of that over into game number two, I mean, this is already the best performance any Western team has given at Worlds in over half a decade. I mean, 2019, 2020, like, that's the last time you were looking at a team from the West at all that was performing like this. You certainly haven't gotten it in the 2020s yet, and so I'm really, really happy for Fly. Let's see if they can keep their foot on the gas. The series not even over. We're going to game two. If Gen.G goes down 0-2, we are really starting to hit, like, the panic emergency alert button. If FlyQuest somehow is able to get that 2-0 lead, that's gigantic. So are they going to be able to do it, or is Gen.G going to be able to tie up the series like a lot of people are expecting? Well, the winner of game number two was Gen.G. They are going to take game number two. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this was more the Gen.G that I think we were all expecting going into this one. This was not a particularly close one from these two teams, and that's kind of what we expected this series to be. As much as I'm happy that FlyQuest ended up winning game number one, I'm not sure that's going to be a trend that continues further along throughout this series, and this was definitely a game that reiterated this, because really all Gen.G needed to unlock themselves in a series like this against a team like FlyQuest, they needed to realize, no, we can't draft these sane comps. We have to draft Nidalee Kassadin as our mid-jungle duo, and because that is so horrible and so not playable in so many instances, we're gonna win anyways. It's such a ridiculous draft here from Gen.G. I think 90% of the time I rip a team to shreds for drafting this, but if you feel comfortable pulling this out on the world stage, then go ahead, man. Canyon's Nidalee can really ail all wounds, and so, credit to Gen.G. For FlyQuest, it just felt like they were so much less active in the early game. I shouldn't say active, it's just the plays weren't working nearly as well. I actually think their draft is infinitely better in terms of consistency. I definitely do not think this is some sort of draft diff in favor of Gen.G. I mean, you can never say that about Nidalee plus Kassadin. That is just giga doomed for Gen.G in a lot of, scenarios, but the Nunu just actually couldn't do anything throughout this entire game, which we will talk about moving forward. He couldn't even secure objectives, which is definitely a major issue if you're trying to play Nunu. But for Gen.G, player of the game, kind of up in the air. I think there's really a couple of options. For me, it's going to go to Pays. He was the one that was taking over in a lot of the team fights down the stretch of the game. I can realistically see this going to Canyon because of the early game, but more specifically, this could go to Chovy as well for just kind of making the game inevitable for Gen.G. He was actually, ironically enough, the one that was winning early. He was the one getting a lot of the resources early for Gen.G, and so whoever you want to give it to, I think is kind of up to you, but Pays, for me, was definitely the most impressive in a lot of these fights. I've been, a huge Pays fan over the course of his short career the last 2 years. I've kind of died on the hill that I think he's one of the best AD carries in the world. That's kind of become commonplace opinion now. I don't think he's boosted at all by having good teammates around him or anything like that. I think this guy would be one of the best AD carries in the world regardless of where he's playing, and this was just another example of that. And quite frankly, Ashe looks really strong in this series. We've seen Ezreal kind of be like a super high priority, low resource AD carry throughout this tournament and probably be the most successful one, but a lot of that is the Chinese teams. A lot of that is the LPL teams that have really been able to pick up Ezreal and make him look like $1 million. I think when you're looking at teams that are a little bit slower or maybe a little bit weirder in terms of the drafts that they want to go for, Ashe is just something that fits basically anywhere and is so consistent at what it accomplishes. It can be a primary carry in terms of the damage. It can be more of a supporting facilitative threat. Like Ashe, I think, will take precedent and priority, and that's why I think Gen.G was super happy to be one Ashe in this game. It's either going to get picked or banned pretty early on in the draft for the rest of this series, and it's good to see that both of these AD carries can actually perform really well on it. Not that that was ever really up for debate, but like I said, Chovy, excellent. He ends up outplaying a gank in the mid lane and killing Inspired to really accelerate himself on the Kassadin. And the moment he hits level 11, this game is over. There's actually no way to stop him in a side lane. There is nobody on the FlyQuest team that can answer him. The only champ that ever had a chance was going to be the Orianna, was going to be Quad, and it just never was going to happen. And so credit to Chovy. I think he's going to go undervalued for how good he was this game. This is not the easiest game in the world to play Kassadin in, and it still really worked out for him. Canyon was incredibly good outside of that one weird dive on the bot side that they completely failed on Whippo. Outside of that, his tempo was excellent. As Nidalee, you're not supposed to be controlling objectives in the mid game nearly as well as he was against a Nunu. Like, it's genuinely absurd how free it was for him to be able to just out-tempo Inspired. This was a great bounce-back game from Canyon, and again, kind of reiterates the point that you just don't really want him on facilitators. You want him on something that can be super aggressive. Again, might need to be a ban for Fly moving forward. Keen, Lahens, they were fine. Keen was a bit overeager on the Jax this game, ends up diving Quad, I think it is, in the mid lane and dying for no reason, but outside of that, I mean, this team was so far ahead by 20 minutes that there was almost nothing they could do to completely throw it away. This was a stomp as a response to game number 1, and for Fly, like I said, really where it all went wrong is just this team needs to win in the early game. You get infinitely outscaled here by Kassadin and Jax. There's just no way that you're ever going to be able to compete if you hit these 5v5s. You have to win early game, and you have to use what I would consider to be your gigantic mid-game power spike from this comp to be able to, get a lot of the objectives and start getting free stats that Gen.G isn't able to answer, and they just were never able to do that in terms of how their roster is constructed. And how they ended up playing the early game, obviously, with Nunu getting behind. It's pretty much disaster. Inspired is going to get dud of the game here. I didn't really have to think about this one all that much. Inspired just did not have a particularly good game. If he was more active early on, or if he had actually successfully, I guess, succeeded on some of the ganks that he went for, I think perhaps this game looks a bit different, but because he didn't, FlyQuest was doomed. There was really no way after 10 or so minutes into this game that they were ever going to be able to recover. I'm not going to blame Whippo for the scoreline. I think a lot of the plays that he ended up dying in were generally fine. Masu's scoreline looks a lot worse than he ended up playing. He was playing an AD carry in a lane swap meta where the team was down 5k gold at 10 minutes, and it's like, okay, well, you're doomed. You can never play the game out. Busio was whatever. The scoreline, again, looks horrible. I think some of the plays are generally fine, but most of the time, he was just going in after Bwipo, and so you just have to live with what FlyQuest was in this game. I expect this to be more of the norm in terms of what the rest of the series looks like. It doesn't take away anything from game number 1, but I think Gen.G got maybe reality checked in that first game, and I think they've woken up. So we'll see if that ends up being the case. Obviously, we're going into a game number 3 here, tied at 1 apiece. You guys know I think this is the most important game of the series. As bad as game 2 was, if FlyQuest comes out and wins game number 3, especially because they might be on the blue side, but with Fly, who knows, they love red side. But, you know, if they end up getting a draft that I think has more options going into the later half of the game and they can actually play out the part that they've been really good at over the course of this year, then you never really know. They're not entirely out of it, but Gen.G definitely looks like they've taken full control of this series, or I guess retaken control of what they were expected to have in this series. We'll see if they can hang on to it, but how's it going to play out, especially in this tie series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and the impossible is becoming a reality somehow, some way. FlyQuest is 1 game away from taking down the favorite to win the entire tournament in the quarterfinals. What are we doing? This is not Gen.G being horrible, although there are some plays that are just not very good, and we'll talk about it. The bot lane in particular for Gen.G has just not been good enough so far in this series, with obviously the exception of game number 2, where Pays was excellent, but in their losses, they've just not been good enough. But truly, this is FlyQuest playing better. At the end of the day, it really is just FlyQuest being the better team in terms of their execution, and quite frankly, it's them having the best player on the Rift, player of the game, Masu, in the AD carry role. If you wanted a star-making performance, if you ever wanted to anoint someone as the next face of the LCS, especially now with like Jojo Pyun leaving, well, here you go, it's Masu. Masu is the star, the face of the LCS. This is the guy that you need to keep your eyes out for, because this was a world-class performance. This is a top, 580 carry in the world type of game here from Masu. It was genuinely unreal. I can't undersell how perfect he had to be in this game in order for it to go as easily as it did for Fly. Now, obviously, this should have never been a game that they lost. They were gifted 2 kills, a double kill in the early game down in the bot lane, because Gen.G goes for one of the stupidest dives I've ever seen. It's this random 3v2 dive down in the bot lane on Masu and Busio, and all Bwipo has to do is TP in, and all of a sudden the dive is over. I think they even survive if Bwipo doesn't TP in. I really don't think that they needed to TP, but Bwipo TPs in, Pays shifts forward, actually blinks forward and tries to play aggressive to secure a kill onto Bwipo, doesn't get it. They end up getting double knocked up by Busio, and Masu gets a double kill at like 4 minutes into the game. From that point onwards, it's basically over, because for the 3rd game in a row, I like FlyQuest draft better. I know that might be more controversial in game 2, but to me, that's results-based analysis. Casted in Italy, it's just never going to be sold to me as like a good idea on the world stage, but this is another draft that I think is just better for Fly. I think Kai'Sa is actually really good in the lane swap meta, specifically as an answer to Ezreal, because she is this like hyper carry in the back half of the game, but her early game is the most punishable thing. You can't really be punished by Ezreal in that way, especially if you're going to lane swap, and so Kai'Sa just ends up being really consistent into Ezreal, which is obviously great, but then you look at the scaling of this team, they outscale Gen.G by a lot, and I think they have early prio down on the bot side of the map if they do want to lock into the 2v2, and so now you're sitting in a position where you're playing double AD carry, double marksman, and you have an early lead, and you have like an Urgot for side laning if you need to in the later half of the game. You have a lot of the players on their most comfortable picks. Quad played so much Zeri over the course of this year. You had a player like Busio, who was called a Rakan one-trick for a lot of last year, like Bwipo's on Urgot. You have so many players that feel comfortable. This is a game that FlyQuest should win, and that's exactly what they did. They out-executed Gen.G. Now, I do think that there were some flaws in terms of their, execution. Inspired's 1 death was completely avoidable, and honestly, in other circumstances, that could have completely thrown the game away. That was one of the worst calls I've ever seen. Like, you went from a 3.5, 4K gold lead down to like a 1K gold lead within the span of 1 minute, purely from just getting antsy, like over eager. This team has been so patient over the course of not only this tournament, but this series, and to just randomly throw it all away in that play felt like it was an absolute disaster. Luckily, it doesn't end up costing them, but, also some really good team fights coming in from Chovy, and, he was really trying to turn the game back around. Chovy had a phenomenal game on the Sylas. It just didn't really end up mattering. FlyQuest was too far ahead, and the gold was on the right people. It was on the Kai'Sa, and Masu was the best player in the game. Again, you want to talk about, like, a star-making performance. We talked about this a bit with Elk in game number 4 against Hanwha life where it's just like, sometimes you see that performance and you're like, this really will solidify, this will stay in people's minds forever, especially fans of the team. This is what you're going to talk about when it comes to Masu. You're going to remember this game. This is a legacy game for him, but please do not undersell Busio. Like, that is the one thing that I want people to make sure to take away from this. This was a wonderfully great Rakan game from Busio. I mean, this was like generationally good. The bot lane in general just completely gapped Pays and Lehens, and that is just unreal to say. Obviously, the early kills helped, but they outplayed them in the late game as well. Inspired was really good outside of that one overstretch. I think he was really, really good at being able to soak up CC and damage, and for peeling for Masu at the end of this game. If, you know, Bwipo and Inspired weren't quite as active in terms of making sure the Kai'Sa was alive, I think a lot of these instances would have gone worse for Fly. Quad ends up getting that quadra kill at the end of the game on Zeri. This champion still does a lot less damage throughout most of the game than you would want, but she does eventually get there at like 4 or 5 items, as you would hope with the marksman. Bwipo was awful for a majority of this game, looked like he was actively going to lose it, and then eventually we got to the 5v5s and he started completely smurfing, as Bwipo ends up doing. It's just a ridiculous game for FlyQuest. I could go on and on about the things that they ended up doing here, but I really think it can come down to just saying that they played better, because they did. They just played better in this game, and they're one game away from making the semifinals of Worlds. And then for Gen.G on the other side, panic button, red button, it is freak out mode time. Like, this is worst case scenario. If you lose to FlyQuest, that narrative of chokers for the org, for, you know, Chovy as a player, whatever, right? It is going to get amplified by a billion. You cannot afford to lose this series. It would be complete disaster mode, and that's even including the fact that Chovy actually is playing really well right now. He was obviously really big in the early game on the Cassin. I thought he was excellent in this game on the Sylas. It just didn't matter. Like, they were so far behind in terms of gold. Sylas didn't have enough damage to actually be able to break through anything, and their main damage dealer in the Ezreal was playing horrible. Pays and Lehens completely let this team down. Whoever you want to give dud of the game to is up to you. Pays arcane shifts right into Busio, or I guess right into FlyQuest at the start of this game to give a free double kill over to Masu, but then you look at these team fights and he's way too far forward. He's getting caught out by Bwipo on these flips, and it's just really not ideal. His positioning is bad, his damage is bad, he's playing bad. I don't know what to say. He was really good in game 2, but the Ezreal looks like a bad pick currently for both of these teams. And then Lehens, like, he's dud of the game for me. Did he do anything this game on Braum? He landed ultimates. Did he land a single Q this entire game? I feel like every single one of them whiffed. I don't know what's going on. This guy is playing miserable. I don't think I've ever seen Lehens play worse than what he is playing like today, and that's just not acceptable. Keen was mega fed in this game, and they couldn't really do anything about it because Bwipo was just grouping most of the time. After the 25-minute mark, Canyon was whatever, like, essentially irrelevant, was wasting ultimate at the start of these fights. FlyQuest was kiting it out, you know, getting their cooldowns back and then re-engaging in a lot of these circumstances, which just makes Edge 20 so much less valuable. Like, it's just not good. Chovy is literally having to 1v9, and I know it feels like, oh, he's like dick riding Chovy again. I'm sure I've already gotten that comment somewhere, but I'm just gonna say it the way that I genuinely feel it. There were multiple fights that Chovy single-handedly won for Gen.G, and yet this team just couldn't follow up on it. It is disaster zone right now for Gen.G. If they lose game number 4 in particular, I mean, there's no coming back from that. At that point, the reputation is just going to spiral out of control. That's what people will remember. But even if you win game 4, like, you've got to win both. You have to win this series. This is unlosable for Gen.G in terms of your rep and in terms of your confidence. But for FlyQuest, if they somehow, some way manage to win just one more game in this series, they're moving on to the semifinals to take on T1. And, like, I'm not going to say they can win that series, but, like, if you can beat Gen.G, you can beat T1. It's just ridiculous stuff coming in from FlyQuest. This is the best they've performed ever, and this is one of the best NA teams of all time. Can they secure the deal? Are they going to be able to close it in 4, or is Gen.G going to keep this banger series alive and send us to a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and for the first time here at Worlds in 2024, we are heading to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. I am so excited, so pleasantly excited and surprised by how this series has gone. Obviously, FlyQuest being in this position in the first place is miraculous, but Gen.G is certainly not giving this free win over quietly. They are not letting this be taken by FlyQuest FlyQuest without a fight, and that's exactly what Gen.G put up in this game, is a strong fight. They once again get back onto blue side. FlyQuest basically opts into the exact same draft as game number 2, except I think Gen.G have an even better comp this time around. I really like the way they close out their draft. I think it's a lot more cohesive. You know, I didn't like Gen.G's draft all that much in game number 2, mostly because of the Kassadin. I think Nidalee Kassadin is just a very weird mid-jungle duo that doesn't really have a ton of synergy, and you could potentially take advantage of that. In the middle of the map, I think Tristana has so much more cohesion with something like a Nidalee, because you can play more aggro around the mid lane early, you can skirmish a lot more. Even something like the K'Sante instead of the Jax, I think Jax is obviously better, but K'Sante is still very good in this role, and K'Sante is phenomenally good into Renekton, and so you don't really have to worry about that too much. You get Pays back on something like the Ashe, just generally so much more comfort. This is the best draft that Gen.G has had this entire series, in my opinion, and FlyQuest once again opting into a more standard comp, which I just don't think is going to work for them against one of the best teams in the world. You have to draft something a little bit weird, and you have to try to be able to get advantages early, or you have to scale incredibly hard. I feel like these mid-game spike comps that you've ended up drafting, where you want to play around like the Ezreal and the Renekton and the Sejuani, and that, you know, that kind of skirmish potential, I just don't know if that's necessarily the strategy that's going to work for them against Gen.G. I feel like you need to index somewhere, and I just don't think this draft ends up doing that. But I don't think you lost in draft or anything like that. I think this game is still very winnable if these two teams are equal, but they are not, and I think we saw that in this game. When Gen.G wins, they just completely outperform Fly. Like, as much as I've been hyping up FlyQuest in their wins, they absolutely outplayed Gen.G in games 1 and 3. I'm not even really considering that all that up for debate, but when Gen.G wins, they clearly prove, like, hey, when we're doing our thing, when we get to play our game, it's not even going to be close. It's not even going to be in the same ballpark, and you gotta take away Canyon's Nidalee. I mean, everybody has learned this at some point throughout their careers. It feels like FlyQuest is having to learn this the hard way. I don't know if that means that you ban it out on blue side when you take that for game 5. By the way, I hope they take blue side for game number 5. If they don't, that's a disaster. But whatever it is, like, you can't really allow Canyon to play this champion. It's just his best champ by such a large margin. The only times that, you know, Gen.G has looked beatable, in my opinion, is when Canyon is on these tanky facilitators like the Sejuani or like the Skarner, as we've seen throughout this series. If you allow him to play something that can be super proactive in the early game, it's just basically impossible to beat him. He's the best jungler in the world by far when he gets to play that style. If I'm Gen.G, I'm either picking Nidalee, or I'm picking Zyra, or I'm picking something like that, something that can just, you know, clear incredibly quickly and try to carry games, because that's just what will win games for you. But, you know, Nidalee definitely does that job well, and this was a dominant game from Canyon, one of the best games he's played, if not the single best game he's played at the entire tournament up until this point. Keen was also obviously ginormous. Bwipo was just completely abused throughout this entire game in multiple different areas. He gets that 2v1 kill on Masu very early on in the game, and it just kind of snowballs out of control from there. It's very funny to me that K'Sante has kind of dropped off in priority as this tournament has gone along. I get that he doesn't have a great matchup into the best top laner in the game right now in Jax, but when Jax is not available, K'Sante's still pretty damn good. He's still one of the best champions in the entire game, and he still can do basically whatever he wants, especially if you give him any sort of gold in the early game. All of a sudden, that acceleration becomes so much easier for him. But, you know, it wasn't just Keen and Canyon, it was everybody. I mean, Pays and Lehans were a lot more stable. Pays looks like a completely different player when he gets to play something like Ashe as opposed to the Ezreal. No more Ezreal. Ezreal's 0-4, I think, so far in this series. At the very least, he's 0-3. I don't remember what happened in game number 1, because it's just been a blur. It's been quite a morning so far, but no more Ezreal. I'm out on Ezreal. This champ is just not working today. It's worked so well at the tournament for a lot of different teams, not for these two. Like, you got to pivot to something else, Kai'Sa or Ashe. Like, they've really got to be the picks over the course of the last few games here, but Pays looks like a completely different beast on Ashe. Even Chovy started to get things together towards the back half of the game. A couple of wasted summoner spells from him at the beginning. Really nice gank from Inspired. Inspired actually goes deathless in this game. Very funny, but Chovy needs to start locking in. Like, I thought he was excellent in game number 3. Again, I will die on the hill that Sylas game would have won them the game in 90% of circumstances, except Fly was just way too far ahead. But the Tristana was not nearly as good, and he kind of looks tilted. This is a player that has been talked about as somebody who doesn't perform in big moments in the past, even though he's like a 6-time LCK champion and he's won MSI, whatever, right? Like, I guess he doesn't perform in big moments, and if that's going to be the case here in game number 5, that narrative is only going to spiral out of control. Again, he needs to lock in. This got better, and the back half of this game was ginormous from him. He was doing so much damage on Tristana, a champion that I continue to think is undervalued. But Gen.G just looked so much more like Gen.G. They just have to do this. They have to be able to control the early game. If they do that, this series and this final game is not going to be close. And then for Fly on the other side, like, this is more of, I guess, what you would expect. It's them going for plays and, you know, like a couple of them working in the early game. Inspired actually gets a bit of gold here, but the primary win condition for this team is playing around these skirmish objectives in the mid game. Like, you are a mid game focused draft here, and it just doesn't end up working. Like, that's such a hard style to pull off against Gen.G because you don't really have prio in lanes early, especially if the Ashe is going to be, dominating in a lane swap, and then you also don't really scale as well as the enemy team because you're playing into like Cassante, Tristana, Ashe. It's just, double marksman. It's very difficult to end up breaking through that, and so you're not really in a position at all where you're able to control the tempo of the game. You really just need to capitalize on your one power spike. It's such a difficult comp to execute. I just don't really like drafting it for this team. I didn't like it in game 2. I liked it better than what Gen had in game number 2, but I think this is a comp you got to throw out the window, and I think they will if they're on blue side. But Whippo, a pretty obvious choice for dud of the game. I mean, 070, he was targeted so much by Gen.G, so many resources put into taking him down over and over again. I very much considered Quad for dud of the game as well because he was awful in this game, and your one win condition in terms of being able to scale this thing out is Orianna, and it just doesn't feel like Quad is going to be able to take over the game on this champion. We've seen it both times that he's played it across this series so far, but I don't think either of the solo laners play well. Masu and Busio were definitely worse here. Ezreal just seems to be not working out for either of these teams. Again, a champion that has worked incredibly well at the tournament so far, but not in this series. Inspired ends up deathless, but he didn't really do anything in this game. It just wasn't a good look for FlyQuest. They were completely out macroed and completely out team fought in basically every circumstance. They got completely rolled, but they've already bounced back from a loss once in this series to go up 2-1, and they're back on blue side. Blue side has been so strong over the course of this tournament, and especially over the course of this series so far. If Fly can get another one of those big draft gaps, and they can get an early lead, or they have the scaling, or anything like that, anything can happen here. If they walk away from this series with the win, it's miraculous. But even if they lose game number 5, I want to reiterate, they have put up such an unbelievable fight. Nothing from this point onwards would be disappointing for me because they have already done everything and more from what they were expected to do. But this is a must-win for Gen.G. It's not the same for Fly, where it's like, oh, you put up a good effort. If you lose this, it is complete disaster zone, blow everything up. One of the most talented teams in league history out in quarterfinals to a North American team. Like, there is no coming back from that. In terms of legacy, that is a permanent hit to all of these players, including Chovy. And so this is a must-win for Gen.G. FlyQuest is out there to prove everybody wrong. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be moving on to the semifinals of the World Championships. FlyQuest got so close. They came so close to miraculously knocking off what a lot of people consider to be the best team in the world, but alas, they fall. They are not able to overcome the last hurdle, and at the end of the day, Gen.G simplifies the process. They have a really smart draft strategy. They end up getting themselves into some very comfortable positions, and they're just able to take the game. They force FlyQuest out of their own comfort zone. They force them onto things like the Yone. FlyQuest want to go for these crazy picks like the Fiddlesticks and the Set, and obviously these are great, but this game comes down to the draft ideology. FlyQuest drafted 3 winning lanes, which is hard to do in pro. It's really hard for teams to give away 3 winning lanes. That's great. And they have no scaling. They have absolutely no way to win a 5v5. You have to win this game early. You have to dominate laning phase, and Gen.G says, what are we the best in the world at? Slowing the game down, not allowing things to get out of control, and playing our speed, and that's exactly what they did. They didn't allow Fly to pick these 3 winning lanes and actually try to capitalize on it. They created a scenario where they were just going to inevitably get outscaled. You put Chovy on something like the Smolder, and even though he's been struggling a bit in this series, you give him the opportunity to scale up, and you give him the opportunity to just farm and get to the point in the game where he can start obliterating people. That's what he does best. At the end of the day, that is Chovy's core. He can do a lot more than that, but when you really want to boil it down, like, that's what he does at the best in the world level is, play the basics of League of Legends, and that's what he did here. He's going to get player of the game for game number 5. I just don't really think it's possible to give it to anybody else for this 5th and final game. I seem to be a little bit higher on his overall series performance than a lot of people. His game 5 was really good, and I thought his game 3 was pretty solid as well. I understand the negativity surrounding game 4, in particular on the Tristana, where he was just making a lot of uncharacteristic, like micro mistakes, like using summoner spells for no reason. And then, of course, game number 1, which I also don't think was particularly good from him. But at the end of the day, if you show up in game 5, I kind of forgive you. Like, it just kind of is what it is. That's how it ends up going. Chovy ends up being the clutch factory, ends up having, like, I don't know, 12 CS FPS per minute on the Smolder. He gets to, 225 on the Smolder, the breakpoint at like 20 minutes into the game. That's got to be the fastest of anybody at Worlds, let alone like it's got to be one of the fastest at all this year. Like it's just ridiculous how quickly he was able to get to his breakpoint, and then eventually he just completely tore up every single team fight. There was no way for them to actually deal with the Smolder. So long as he was playing relatively safe, he was never actually going to get caught in any of these circumstances. He got caught once early by Fiddlestick's ultimate, and I think Set ended up ulting in as well down on the bot side. But outside of that, Chovy played a near perfect game here in game number 5, about as good as you can get. Whatever nerves were there that were clearly on his face in game 4, they were gone here in game 5, because this was as cool, calm, and collected as Chovy has ever been on the international stage. But player of the series for me, maybe a bit controversially, I don't know how popular this is going to go to Canyon in the jungle. I don't really know if this is going to be kind of the normal takeaway. It was very difficult to find a player of the series here because it just felt like everybody was struggling when their team was losing. Like Gen.G had so many problems in games 3 and 1 that it was really hard to identify one player that just kind of kept them stable. But when you're looking at the wins, I'm looking at Canyon being incredibly important on both of the Nidalee games, and then still very relevant here on the Skarner in game number 5. I was concerned a bit at the beginning of this draft because FlyQuest ends up being given Yone with no Aurora on the board. They want to trade it for the Skarner, but, the more this draft went on, the more I said it was clear that, Gen.G was basically daring FlyQuest to try to beat them early, and, they knew they had the scaling, and they just wanted to slow the pace down. It's a good idea from Gen.G, and Canyon, I think, executed that well. This was his best Skarner game that he has maybe played all year. You also have a lot of comfort for the bot lane. Pays gets his Ziggs. This is something that was banned out against him super regularly domestically. He wasn't the biggest game breaker, but he did catch out Masu really importantly in the mid lane to be able to start snowballing some gold out of control. That was huge for the team, and then Lehen's obviously being able to pick that up. He looked a lot more comfortable on the Maokai than he did on basically anything else in this series. Keen was pretty solid here on the Rumble. He was given a ton of resources in the early game. They tried their best to take Bwipo out of it in the laning phase. It didn't necessarily work, but Keen still was able to get online. Overall, just a good game from Gen.G. I mean, you have to tip your cap to them. This was a classic Gen.G game. Like, you can say, oh, Fly picked Fiddlesticks in Set, and they rushed that Baron, and, they threw away the game or whatever, right? We'll talk about it when we get to Fly. But at the end of the day, when you really boil down the essence of game number 5, it's Gen.G playing the exact way that they have played all year long to get themselves to this position. Just completely understanding their own win condition, boiling it down to knowing that they can win the 5v5 team fights and playing for their mid laner. It really was as quintessential Gen.G as you can get, and they're going to be moving on to the semifinals for it. But for FlyQuest, again, I don't want any negativity out of this series, because how could you possibly be negative about FlyQuest? You want to criticize the Baron call. I think that that's totally valid. I would never make that call personally, but honestly, in this situation, I think it's justifiable in the sense that FlyQuest at that point in time, when you're talking 20, 22 minutes into the game, they are never winning a 5v5 ever again. Like, Smolder has hit his stacks, Rumble is starting to get online, Pays is really strong on the Ziggs. You are legitimately never able to win a 5v5 from that point in the game onwards. There's just, unless they completely screw up, right, there's just no way for it to ever happen, and so you have to get something. They go for the Baron Rush, and honestly, they probably should have gotten away with it. I feel like a Scooby-Doo villain saying that. I should have gotten away with it too if it weren't for this stupid Ziggs ult, but, at the end of the day, like, they got caught out, and it is what it is. They went for the big risky play, and it didn't work out. I would much rather a North American team who's not even supposed to be here in the first place go down fighting and, throw something at the wall and see if it sticks, rather than just try to play Gen.G's game and end up just randomly losing in the 5v5s. I love that this team was willing to take risks, that they were willing to try the things that they thought could help them win the game. That's exactly what they did here, and it just didn't work out. But I'm not going to criticize them for attempting to do what they think they needed to do in order to surprise and take something off of Gen.G. Again, they just got outplayed. Masu's going to get dead of the game for game 5. It feels really bad to give him this because he was so good across this series. He was the reason that they were in it in the first place, but this Kalista just fell entirely flat. I think you could very realistically give this to Quad in the mid lane as well. Yone was the win condition, and, Gen.G took the big gamble of, like, we're going to give you Yone. We're going to give you the strongest champion in the game, and we're going to trust that you don't know how to play it, because Quad's a control mage player. He's not somebody who plays these assassin, fighter, bruiser type of champions, and, unfortunately for Fly, like, they were right. Gen.G was right to give over Yone, because Quad just never felt all that comfortable on the Yone. Inspired is obviously a Fiddlesticks one trick, or, he was in the past. This guy's a Fiddlesticks main. It didn't work this game. Generally speaking, the flash engage is really strong, and I think Fiddle, has a role in the meta, but you got to be able to play from ahead, and he just wasn't able to do that. Bwipo was really put down in the early game. They put so many resources into trying to get him behind, and he survived. Basically, all of them actually stayed even with Keen for a majority of the early game. What's Set supposed to do in the back half of this game? Once again, you're just indexing so hard into winning early and to winning these lanes, and to Fiddlesticks in particular having a ton of prio, and you just weren't able to actually get that, and that means a lost game. But this team just pushed the best team in the world to 5 games. And regardless of whether or not you want to believe that Gen.G is the best team in the world, they have been the best team in the world over the course of this year in terms of the results that they've accomplished. They are the most recent international champions, and they are kind of defending their, number 1 status, even if they didn't win the LCK at this tournament. For FlyQuest to even be in the vicinity of them and to push them to a game number 5, it's one of the biggest accomplishments NA has ever had. If they would have won this game number 5, this would have been the biggest upset in League of Legends history. I don't know. I can't think of a single other one that would have been bigger than this in terms of like an upset factor. People brought up C9 versus Afrika. Like, C9 was maybe not the favorites in that series, but they certainly weren't nearly as big underdogs. People will bring up G2 versus RNG. I think that one's more understandable because RNG was on the Golden Road path and G2 wasn't even the best team in Europe. But at the end of the day, like, this to me, in the current state of League of Legends with the gap between the East and the West, this would have been the biggest upset of all time, and they're just barely not able to pull it off. But you got to keep your head held high. This is a massive statement from North America that you have to take them seriously, and I think everybody picked that up over the course of this tournament. But for Gen.G, I mean, you did it. You survived disaster. You're able to win this series. You're moving on to the semifinals. And honestly, you might even feel reprieved to see T1 on the other side of that. We'll talk about it in just a second when we look at the bracket. But this is certainly not a matchup that they are unfamiliar with. Gen.G seemed very surprised by some of the strategies that FlyQuest employed. I think having a series against an opponent they know so well in the upcoming round might be really good for them. This might be the closest any team comes throughout the rest of the tournament to taking down Gen.G. And FlyQuest is going to wish they landed the shot. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2024 Worlds Quarterfinals overview and analysis. We're done. The quarterfinals are over. We know our top 4 teams now in the semifinals. You can see it up on the screen. Weibo Gaming and Bilibili on the top side, T1, and Gen.G on the bottom side. We are guaranteed an LPL versus LCK finals. It's just which of the 2 teams are, which of the 4 are going to be representative of their own regions in the finals. That's going to be the question. So we'll quickly go over the semifinals matchups here. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on Weibo and Bilibili because that series is going to happen first, and so there's not going to be a series in the middle. I'll talk more about T1 Gen.G at the end of the Weibo and Bilibili series, as we typically do on this channel, but I just want to say that these are the 4 teams that are probably playing, I'm not going to say the best at Worlds right now, because replace Weibo with Hanwha Life, right? Like, that's generally how it is, but these are the 4 teams that I feel like deserve to be in the semifinals right now, outside of HLE. I think Bilibili, T1, and Gen.G are probably the 3 teams that are playing the best in the world right now, again, if you don't count HLE, and Weibo is one of those teams that you just can't, like, not believe in because of the way that they play the game, and so it's going to be fun no matter what, but my prediction still stands. When I did my pre-tournament bracket, like, obviously these outcomes looked a bit different, but Bilibili Gaming and Gen.G, I think, are still favorites to make the finals. BLG should be more locked in to beat a team like Weibo Gaming. You never really know. Weibo's got complete magic. Like, they are just, I don't even know really how to explain them. They win series that they're absolutely not supposed to, but we've seen this matchup a ton over the course of this year, and BLG has gotten the handle of it basically every time. And it's kind of the same thing for T1 Gen.G, where, I mean, when you talk about T1's kryptonite, it's Gen.G. Like, the one team that T1 has just been unable to beat over the past few years, even with this core that's been able to go back-to-back in the World Finals and whatever. The one team that they've not been able to beat is Gen.G. The one player that Faker has not been able to beat is Chovy. I talked about it at the end of the game number 5, but Gen.G might honestly be looking forward to facing T1 instead of like a FlyQuest, right? This might be an easier series for them because at the very least they are familiar with T1. They know what to expect. They know what to prepare for. FlyQuest was such a wild card in this series that, maybe Gen.G is looking forward to it. Obviously, T1's never going to make it easy in the semifinals. MSI winners are kind of cursed in terms of going around and doing something at Worlds. We saw that last year with T1 taking down JD Gaming, and so you never really know what's going to happen, but my prediction still stands. Bilibili and Gen.G in the finals. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comment section below. Do you believe in Weibo or T1 more than I do? Do you think we're going to get a rematch of last year's World Finals once again? Because it is definitely still on the table. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below, but that is going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people. people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the semifinals. We'll be covering the finals of this tournament. We've covered everything over the course of this year, and we will also be covering the offseason. So much news is already starting to come out. The LEC offseason in particular is really rolling. I imagine now that FlyQuest has been eliminated, North America will get started rather soon as well. So if you want to be caught up on all the offseason news, we're going to be covering that after this tournament is over. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all